This is October 31st. This is a League of Women Voters unit meeting. And we have a discussion topic of immigration today. And our speakers are Scott Cougill and Ken Jameson. And I think, Ken, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself a little bit more than I do, and then we'll turn it over to Scott and then discussion.
Okay, so I will introduce myself and then talk about immigration.
Yep, that's it.
So you said about 20 to 25 minutes, and I'll try and keep it to that. So I'm Ken Jameson. I'm a retired economics professor from University of Utah. I worked in Latin America, virtually every country except for Colombia, Honduras, and El Salvador, starting with a Peace Corps when I graduated from college. Only in about the last 5 years when I was at the U did I get involved in immigration because I realized Latin America is here very much in Utah. And so we got a grant to study undocumented migration into Utah. And we built on that and built on students in one of my, I don't have the mirror thing on. So did
we can see it.
Wonderful study on immigration in context. We printed about 1,000 copies of that. And we were doing that right at the time when immigration got to be a hot issue in Utah. And I'll talk a bit more about Utah versus vis-a-vis immigration later on. So Jill's title seemed to suggest a lot of data. And so it was kind of fun to go back and look at the contemporary data, which I don't really follow. And I sent her a whole series of links if any of you really want to dig into the data on it. But I'm going to do much more a general overview of that. So just talking about migration in general, it's a net concept. You have in-migration, out-migration. And the United States traditionally has had more in-migration than out-migration. And as a result, we now have 45 million foreign-born persons in the United States. It sounds like a lot, but it turns out that as a share of our US population, that's about 13.5%, which is down from the 1970 high, which is about 14.8%. So we do have migrants coming in, but we've had greater numbers and greater percentages before that. Since 2001, we average about a million permanent residents per year. This fell to about 750,000 in 2021 due to COVID and the Trump policies. And I think we need to realize how important the migrants are to our society, to our economy. We have shortages of workers now. We have a lot of unfilled positions. They would be much worse if we didn't have the migrants coming in. In higher education, we find enrollments nationally are actually going down, but the share of immigrants in higher ed enrollments have gone from 22% in 2000 to 34% in 2021. So more and more of our students are foreign-born students. In addition, the migration is what is really keeping us from having a declining population. The US birth rate is about 1.64 per childbearing age woman. And the replacement rate is about 2.1. So if we didn't have immigrants coming in, our population would actually be declining. And again, I mean, there are ecological implications of this, but you do find that when populations decline, your economy and the society comes under a great deal of stress. As Japan discovered that earliest, Europe has discovered it more recently, and even China now is having a population bust, which stresses on their system. Finally, it turns out most businesses in the United States are actually started by immigrants. And so, again, in so many ways, the immigrants contribute. It's obviously a very complex. There are both sides to that, but the positive contributions of immigrants are really quite substantial. So we talked about the million permanent residents. And we have a whole series of other kinds of immigrants coming in. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But I think that it's important to realize that we have an immigration system that's broken. It simply does not function well, and that's a lot our own faults because we don't have good policies toward it. We don't really fund it. For example, just to give you some examples of how broken it is, there's a 2-year backlog in immigration courts just to get decisions on immigration questions. Asylum seekers can wait for 5 years before they actually get a decision. And then if you get caught up in the system, it's Kafkaesque. For example, we fund scholarships for Dreamers, for DACA students at University of Utah. And one of our students got 3 majors with a 4.0 average at the University of Utah, then went on to do an internship and is now working with the ACLU. And her father, they had been here 20 years, undocumented. They had been here 20 years working and contributing to Social Security that they will never collect, et cetera. He was picked up under the Trump administration drag nets that they had, was going to be deported, wasn't deported, and now probably won't be deported, but he doesn't have a court case until 2026, 2027. You can just imagine the kind of disruption that this brings to a family. And it's really part and parcel of the whole system that we had. We almost had an immigration reform in 2006, but being anti-immigrant wins votes, and so that finally went down in Congress. I think the Senate had approved it, or vice versa, and the House of Representatives defeated it. Our last reform was in 1986, and it was augmented in 1996, mainly by strengthening the Border Patrol. And the end result of that reform was essentially to force migrants to stay here, because the general pattern from the Bracero program back to the 1940s on up until that point was that people primarily from Mexico would come, work, and then go back to Mexico. But the immigration reform strengthened the Border Patrol, so people began to fear that they would never get back in, and so they began to stay. And so in many ways, we've benefited from that because it's given us strong migrant communities, but it really stopped a kind of natural flux. And that flux still goes on in recent years, and I haven't looked in the last year or two, but in recent years, for example, Mexico, which had been the major source of our immigrants, in recent years, there have been more out migrants to Mexico than in migrants from Mexico into the United States. So people don't just lose that kind of identification with their originating country. But we interrupted that. For example, I was down in Colombia in May, and I met a gentleman who had worked in New York for 30 years, who had just retired there a year before. He was Colombian, and that's really where he wanted to end up. And so I think there is that kind of a natural flow that we no longer respect. So we saw the number of legal permanent residents. There are also refugees. And I think Scott will give you some more details on those. There's an annual quota that's set. President Trump set the lowest at 18,000 back in 2020. And Biden has set it at 100, wants to set it at 100, has set it at 125,000. But it takes so long because of the system that only 25,000 actually are able to come. In 2017, 85,000 refugees were admitted. In 2020 and 2021, only about 10,000. And so those numbers will gradually go up as we go towards the 125,000, well, depending on the election next year. In addition, there are around 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. And they, of course, get the biggest play. And we, of course, pay a good deal of attention to what's going on at the southern border. And it actually, I just got new information today on what's been happening at the southern border, because the fiscal year 2023, which ended October 1st, data on the migration trends came in. So last year, there were 2.5 million contacts at the southern border, which is the highest it's ever been. There were 2 million the year before. But interestingly, what's happening as, again, you try and adjust the system to allow it to be more orderly than it has a tendency to be. What's happened under the Biden administration is that they've tried to force them in through the legal entry point, so Tijuana, El Paso, et cetera. And so there actually has been a decline of 160,000 contacts in the between border posts areas. So people coming through the Sonora Desert into Arizona, for example. And there's been an increase of 430,000 at the legal entry points. And so you may not have followed, but there have been a whole series of ways of trying to get people to do orderly entries. So there's a website where they can get a number and they can have an appointment to come at a given time. And so that's what's going on there. And I will come back to that because one of the things I want to talk about is the newest upsurge, which is an upsurge in Venezuelans. But let me turn for a moment to Utah. Utah has been relatively welcoming to immigrants. That again has gone up and down. Around 2005, 2006, it became politically expedient to castigate the immigrant. So we moved from providing them with driver's licenses to a driver privilege card, which is a differentiating thing, which actually was the basis of the research study that we did, because we were one of the only places where you could actually identify undocumented migrants. And that allowed us to see how they were integrating into the Utah society. And they integrate very well, as I will mention later. And that was when the English only laws came in and all of that. But by 2010, we had the Utah Compact, which laid out 5 principles for how we should deal with immigration in a humane fashion. So in 2021, it's estimated that Utah had about 278,000 foreign-born citizens or immigrants, people living here, which is 8.3% of the total population, so lower than the national average. And that national average is pushed up by the big states, by California, Texas, and Florida, where most of your immigrants come into. I guess we get them from Latin America, and the winter cold is sort of a disincentive to come. But anyway, some of them get here. Most of them have settled in Salt Lake City. There are about 151,000 in Salt Lake City. Summit, in the data, I think this is from 2020, has about 3,900, and Wasatch County has about 2,800. So the preponderance are in Salt Lake. Utah County has around 47,000. So, but that's a small part of the whole migration experience in Utah, as you think about it. There were 77,000 out migrants in 2021 from Utah and 102 in migrants from other states. And there were 17,000 who moved in from outside the country. So migration is a very, very fluid kind of process. And most people stay put. 2.87 million people just stayed put in 2021, and only 350,000 moved within the state. But nonetheless, migration is now the major contributor to population increase in Utah. I think we now have the second highest birth rate in the country. I don't know if it's North Dakota or Idaho, one of those. But even our birth rate has dropped substantially, and it's below the replacement rate. It's 1.93 per childbearing woman of childbearing age. So in talking about the migrants, let's talk just for a few minutes about the migrants, what we know about the migrants into Utah, and Scott's going to talk much more about that. There is an increasing share of Asian-born immigrants into Utah. The Latin Americans compose the largest group of foreign-born residents, about 47%, but that has dropped from about 2007 until today from about 56%, while the Asian-born share of the Salt Lake City's foreign-born population increased from 19% to 27%. So we're getting a demographic shift, a sort of geographic shift in that. If you look at the migrants, again, in Salt Lake City, they have strong English language ability. So the stereotype is people who never learn the language. But it turns out that 3/4 of Salt Lake City's foreign-born residents speak English well or very well, including 17% who speak English as their only language. And, you know, you all have probably run into kids whose parents discourage them from using their native language. And having spent a great deal of sweat and tears learning Spanish, you say, oh, please don't do that. Keep them bilingual. But nonetheless, the in-migrants are well-educated and becoming more so. About 1/3 of the foreign-born Salt Lake City residents over 25 have bachelor degrees. And in the US, that number is after 2009 is about 49%. So we're getting educated folks as well. They have rising economic stability. And this is one of the things we found with our study of the undocumented, is that their incomes go up quite substantially over time, and that's partly because they will found businesses and start that. We know. You all know probably a lot of businesses that are started by foreign-born. Rico's is probably the biggest one down here. But their household incomes still end up being lower than the average here. And then Scott's going to give you information on the refugees coming in. But I want to give you a little bit more detail on what one of the biggest surges of informal or non-formal immigration is at this point. And that's the Venezuelans that are coming in. Most of the 11 million undocumented people have been here for 20 years or more. Actually, I participate in naturalization ceremonies with the League of Women Voters down at USCIS, and they are very moving. And one of the amazing things is people will talk about their own experience. And the last one I was at, for example, a young man, I think he was from Mexico. He said, "I've been here 33 years," and that's not uncommon. For people just not to go through the naturalization period and just exist here for many, many years as really functioning parts of our society. Well, that hasn't been the case for the Venezuelans. The Venezuelans was a very rich country with oil, and it was traditionally very stable. You had two kind of competing conservative parties, which that all changed in the 1990s with Hugo Chavez. And then Chavez died in 2013, and the government was taken over by Nicolas Maduro, who is both incompetent, venal, and repressive. So not the kind of person you would choose for president. And what happened then was the beginning of a migration, an out-migration of Venezuela. So Venezuela has a population of around 28 million. They have now it's estimated that there are 7.5 million who have emigrated. So 1/4 of their population. So that would be, like in the United States, that would be what, 80 million people leaving our country. We up at the U, we do a group of us retired profs do something we call Grandparents Are In, and we just say we're giving advice to students, and it may be bad advice, but it's free, and we sit and talk. Well, I was doing that yesterday, and there actually was a young Venezuelan woman who came, and we were talking about it. Her mother actually owns a Venezuelan restaurant down on State Street that's actually quite popular and going to expand. And that's, again, an immigrant story. And they were some of the first Venezuelans who came to Salt Lake City because her father had been politically active and was on a hit list, was on a death list. And she now is finishing up at 29 years at the University of Utah. But again, it's this kind of an immigrant story that you hear over and over. But in any case, when the Venezuelan outmigration started, about the first 6 million over the first number of years generally went through Latin America. If you can envision a map, and Scott's going to have graphs for you, and I should have a map so you could envision this. But you would go from Venezuela to the west into Colombia, and then you could go down to Ecuador, down to Peru, down to Chile. And that's what those first 6 million did. And they were welcomed. In many cases, they were given work permits, they were given visas, so on and so forth. But what's happened, and for example, most of them went to Colombia, and Colombia welcomed them. In 2014, there were only 23,000 Venezuelans in Colombia, but by 2022, that had increased by 2.8 million. So you just get a sense of how big that was and what pressure that puts on the Colombian society. So over time, around, I think 58% of those, 59% of those people in Colombia got work permits. But over time, now Colombia is having economic problems, Ecuador is having problems of violence, Peru has political instability. I'm a Latin American development economist, and we clearly haven't done very well. And I don't agree with the Wall Street Journal very often, their editorial page, but their editorialist on Latin America, Mary Anastasio Grady, says that the only solution to the migration problem at our southern border is economic growth and stability in Latin America. That isn't happening. But what's been going on with the Venezuelans? So on the one hand, you now find that those countries are becoming less welcoming, and so people are starting to move out of there. And on the other hand, you find that there have been structures put in place now to facilitate their moving to the border with the United States. The biggest barrier had been the Darien Gap, which is on the border between Colombia and Panama, which is a jungle, very dangerous. And people basically had been held back from that. But what's happened, and I'm telling you some of this just to give you some sense as to how dynamic this whole migration process is. The Gulf Cartel controls that area of Colombia. And they have decided that a good way to make money on, aside from drugs, is to get migrants to pay them to get them through the Darien Gap. So they are now working with locals and are actually setting up camps in the Darien Gap, are providing guides to get people through the Darien Gap. And so what's happening now is the continuing migration from Venezuela and the remigrants from the Latin American countries are now filtering through there, getting into Panama, then moving up through Costa Rica, so on and so forth. And what we do, what our government does, is trying to work with those countries to basically put disincentives on them. And that's primarily we've done with Mexico, with Lopez Obrador, to try and slow that down. But you can see that with that tremendous push out of Venezuela, people are desperate and will come. So what's the Biden administration been trying to do with that? Well, they have essentially tried to discourage people from coming by essentially saying, look, we've given asylum to these people, and what we will do is let them stay and get work permits. 472,000 of them, Venezuelans. Again, we had very few up here before. We will let them do that, but anyone who comes after July 31st, 2023, we will send back. Now, that's been problematic because we haven't had any diplomatic relations with Venezuela. So how do you send them back? We do that all the time with people from Salvador, from Honduras, from Guatemala. but we didn't have diplomatic relations. Well, if you follow the news, we're sort of normalizing over the last month with Venezuela, as long as they will have free elections next year, which is up in the air. But one part of that normalization is removal of sanctions. But another part is that we have started flying Venezuelans who are coming to the border back to Venezuela. So what we're trying to do is to deal with that in-migration and to give a disincentive for that migration to continue on. So
Wow.
my point on that is just to give you a sense as to how complex this whole process is, and that a lot of the southern border migration is pushed by that, but it's all exacerbated. The whole problem is exacerbated by having a migration system that simply doesn't function. So I was going to end up with just some tales of Park City. I was president of the board of Holy Cross Ministries, which has worked with Latinos in Park City area since 1994. But my bottom line is that Park City has adjusted slowly, but very positively to incorporating particularly the lower income Hispanics up there. And that started with an after-school program and then with a preschool program, so on and so forth. But though you don't have many foreign-born immigrants up there, and you have them from all walks of life. You have a Brazilian plastic surgeon who is one of the preeminent plastic surgeons in the country. But you also have folks who clean the hotel rooms and maybe do the gardening for you who are undocumented. But you've adjusted over time in a kind of Utah way. So with that, I will close and turn it over to Scott and welcome questions when Scott's done.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ken. Scott, you're on.
Great. Thank you. It was really interesting and enlightening, Ken. So I'm going to take what he said and narrow it very specifically more to the refugee and specifically here in Utah.
Scott, can you introduce yourself?
Oh, golly. Yeah, that's kind of, I'm going to share my screen and if I can. And then so can you?
Yes.
Yep. Great. Okay, so let me do a quick introduction of myself and the organization. I can jump into numbers. This is always hard when they're doing this. So, okay, so so again, my name is Scott Cougill. I'm the new executive director at the Asian Association of Utah. I started in February, replacing the last executive director, Dr. Shu Chang, who had been here 45 years and was one of the original founders. So I'm new to Utah. We moved from Detroit to here, my wife and me, in February. So I want to introduce the association and then jump into numbers. So the Asian Association exists here. We're based out of Salt Lake City. And what we do is we come alongside victims of human trafficking, refugees, asylum seekers, and really try to help them develop self-sufficiency and thrive. And that's what we're doing. And so it started, why the Asian Association, why a non-Asian leads an Asian association, is that that's really our heritage. Is it started right after the Vietnam War. And when Jim Matheson, governor of Utah, reached out to a number of Asian business leaders in Salt Lake City to help with the refugee crisis of tent camps at our military bases, helped resettle a number of refugees from Southeast Asia, from the Vietnam War, and that then continued to grow and expand. And over time, we continue those social services and have expanded and have helped probably tens of thousands of refugees over those 45 years. To the point now, we really do three things. We have a refugee and immigrant center. We do human trafficking support. And then we have a behavioral health team, a clinic that primarily just also works with refugees. About 25% of refugees that do come into Utah have some sort of trauma that's impacting them from thriving. And so our counselors work with them. And human trafficking is a totally separate thing, but related and overlapping. And we have a team dedicated to really providing care and rescue after an arrest or shutdown of a human trafficking operation. So we do more of the victim support. Okay, that's the backstory. So let me get into some numbers. So, and I'm new to this too, so I'm learning in the general, but basically there's refugee resettlement. There's a thing called primary resettlement and secondary resettlement. So the Asian Association is a secondary resettlement agency. We're not a primary. The primary ones are listed there. We have two big ones, Catholic Community Services and IRC. Most people have heard of them. And we have CRIC, which is actually a Cache County, a new one that just started up this past year that really is part of, oh my gosh, Church World Service. And they are helping primarily in the Logan area with resettlement there. And so these are the numbers. So then in the state of Utah, right, there is a state refugee office that has a state refugee coordinator. There's an advisory board of appointed people by the governor. I've been appointed by the governor to be on the advisory board to the state refugee office. And these are compilations provided by these four entities, numbers that we're working with that we know of. So these would not be people that arrive to Utah on anything other than these special visas. And I'll go through that in a second. So you can see numbers. So this just ended. So this past year, approximately 1,800, if you use the general term refugees, were settled in Utah, of which you can see the breakdowns. So at the Asian Association, we are the only agency that's really working with the Cuban humanitarian visa types, and that's what we're specializing with. And then our refugees are primarily secondary migrants or Afghans. And these are the numbers we're seeing. And then this coming year, each organization commits to a certain number they'll resettle, and it's going to be roughly about the same, maybe 10% more than this past year. And per capita or per numbers, Utah is one of the more progressive states in the nation and has a system that we constantly are getting other state refugee officers visiting to see how we're doing it. So we actually have a pretty good system, and I can answer any questions if we want. But those are some of the numbers in Utah. And then, so here's where they're coming from. And as you can see, like in our instance, right, back 45 years ago, almost all refugees were coming from Southeast Asia. Now, most are coming from these countries, with Congo being the largest number, the Ukraine's, Afghan. These are primarily because we have special immigrant status for Ukrainians and Afghans, and the Cubans as well. And so from a traditional resettlement, it's probably mostly people from Congo and Syria and Sudan and Burmese individuals that have been in refugee camps, primarily in Thailand, for 15 to 20 years, waiting approval to get here, and still Iraqis. But these are the nationalities for this past year. And then by type, of those, approximately almost 1,000 were in the refugee type, and it kind of says the definitions. It can get, there's a lot of detail underneath it, and they all have different benefits they get, as well as rules and care and support. So for example, the US government allows us only 90 days to work with the Cuban entrants to give them case management and help them get connected and going. Even though a work permit takes about a year. And so whereas refugees are getting 12 months of case management and wraparound services, or 15 months if they have kids. And that is basically, there's the basic sort of varieties of people that are coming here. The SIV is that special immigrant visa, primarily Afghan individuals who helped the US during the war. And victims of trafficking is a category in this sense is, so when someone is a victim of trafficking, gets rescued, they start a process of applying for a special visa type called a T visa. And that can take 6 months to 18 months. Once they get that visa, then they get the same benefits that a refugee would receive from arriving from the Congo, for example. So, and that's these 32 this past year are the individuals that were rescued and trafficking, applied for the visa, and got their T visa last fiscal year. And so our other arm of our agency is probably working with about 300 to 400 survivors that are in some process of still pre-T visa attaining that have been rescued this past year here in Utah, either half of them in labor trafficking and half in sex trafficking. And that's my summary of the numbers, Jill, for kind of in Utah. I can go back or answer any questions.
Scott, I think you can hear me. You can probably stop sharing your screen. How many people do you have helping you do all of this work?
Yeah, so our agency has about 50 full-time employees. We really do everything in a public-private partnership. So we're partnering with different government agencies, whether that be federal, state, or county, or even city. And so we tend to be then, we really are, we're a case managed focused, meaning that we have a case manager who's working with the individual to discern what they need and then connecting them to resources, whether we provide them or other groups provide them to get going here locally. And then our behavioral health team, which does counseling, receives referrals mostly from IRC and CCS because they don't do counseling or therapy. And so we'll receive those individuals and help them specifically. And they have their case manager from IRC, but their therapist would be here. And then we have a medical management doctor as well that's part of the team, as well as our own case managers that help. So but we're funded mostly by different government entities, and then the gaps are filled in by private donations.
What about housing? It seems like housing would be a huge challenge.
Yeah, and housing is the challenge for all these agencies, including us, and particularly since most are coming into Salt Lake City. I think that's why we're seeing a lot more resettlement actually go straight to Logan or other areas, because housing challenge isn't as rich. Our challenge here is there actually is capacity for housing. It's just not affordable. And so we do a variety of things to try to make a dent. So we have master leases with the county and city on certain units that we're able to get at a reduced rent that we are responsible for, but then we can place individuals in. And then we're all scrambling to try to, so I have 3 full-time people who do nothing but housing, and they are finding housing, trying to find units that are more affordable, trying to convince landlords that if they allow these immigrants in, refugees, or in our case, we have a number of victims of trafficking, we will make sure that you've got another contact, and we're helping them, because often they're looking for 2, 3, 4 times monthly rent security deposits, and because they don't have the credit and history, and often legal employment at first until time. So housing is a challenge, but everybody across the agencies, as I hear reports, all those 1,800 are housed in long-term housing. They're pretty much straight away. And so the big agencies, they have to have that housing for them before they arrive. So they're arriving and they're going to the housing, ideally where they've got a year rental agreement at some place convenient.
Okay, other questions? I won't monopolize the questions. From you all, what are you thinking? What are you wondering? Martha.
Yeah, I guess I want to kind of go back to the comment that was made that said that 1,000 people were settled in Utah, and sort of maybe put some meat around what settled means, because there's one thing to find a home, to have a place to park yourself at night. There's another thing to get your kids in school. There's another thing to have your visa. You know, so I guess I'm just maybe, I mean, the numbers are astounding. I'm a firm believer we need immigrants throughout the country. So it's all good news to say that Utah is welcoming, but I guess I'm still, you know, sort of rattling all these numbers, but not really understanding what it means for those families in terms of settled.
So it's interesting. So Martha, so people that are settled from another, so refugees in their primary resettlement. Let's pretend it's CCS is the desert. So CCS will be notified that they're going to get a family from Afghanistan months in advance.
What
And
is
so they're
CZF?
assigned, they might know months in advance that they're contracted, that this person is going to arrive on November 17th. And they have 6 kids, and then it's like, go. And so CCS then assigns a case manager who will work with them to do all these wraparound services before they arrive. So they're finding housing, which involves a school district, right? Knowing the school district, they're arranging for preparing for stuff that they're going to need to put into the apartment, and preparing things. And so when the individual family arrives, they're welcomed at the airport by the case manager, usually sometimes volunteers. And then over a course of time, their CCS, for example, the case manager is really understanding them. And they actually now are starting a lot of this before they arrive, these initial conversations, so they can know, hey, this family has this situation, 4 kids, this age. And so they actually can work with the school before they get here. And then they're helping them enroll them in school, helping them get set and Medicaid, getting them set up for everything, all the services and benefits they're eligible for, teaching them how to get places. They go with them to all these places. So they'll go with the family to Granite School District to enroll. They'll go with them to the health screen to make sure they don't have tuberculosis, and they get set up on Medicaid. If they need mental health care, they'll come with them to here and sit outside while they do counseling, and then take them back. They'll teach them how to ride a bus, take them at, UTA and all that kind of stuff. And they are engaged, and they have to connect with the family a minimum of weekly for 12 months.
Wow.
So, and then plus volunteers engage and help, and the partners. The county has a lot of resources. The city has a lot of resources. And so that case manager works with about 25 individuals at a given time, trying to juggle all that. And that's kind of the core point. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, because I've worked with different nonprofits, and it's the wraparound services that trip everyone up, because the how-tos, how to maneuver, how to get medical, all that stuff. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Right. And a little different than the group, some of the numbers that Ken was sharing, right, at the more macro level. At this micro level with the refugees, it's rarely does the parent or individual speak English. Rarely. And so everything has to be done through a bilingual case manager or through interpretation. And we have an interpretation department that supplies interpreters to everybody as well. But that makes it even more challenging, is that they're helping them sign up Medicaid and they don't speak English.
Glenn, I'm going to move it over to Glenn and Shirley. They have a question.
Yes, this is probably mostly for Ken. I worked in the loss prevention for an insurance company for about 30 years, and I witnessed areas where undocumented workers were subject to severe abuse. I remember doing workers' comp surveys where the only lost time accident in 3 years was to a documented worker in a factory of 300. And that one person was injured in a immigration stampede and broke her leg. So my question is, of our foreign-born residents here in Utah or in the U.S., what percentage are undocumented and subject to this kind of abuse? And as a kind of a follow-up question, I don't know if you have this information, but if we legalized all those folks and had a more continual flow of documented immigration into the U.S., what would that do to stabilize our Social Security funding?
Well, that's a series of questions, really good questions. So they estimate about 11 million undocumented out of the 48 million foreign born. So they're counted in that 48 million. So, you know, what is that? 2.5% are undocumented. And you're completely correct. They are subject to abuse. We run into a lot of undocumented people various ways, and we've had 3 or 4 experiences of people who clean houses, right? And they will be cleaning a house for a house showing, right? And it'll take them 2 days to do a deep clean, and at the end, the person will say, "Well, I'm not going to pay you, and I'll report you to the immigration services," which is a big threat. And there are in some states there are some protections. I think California they can get recourse in California. In Utah, we've tried to check that out, and it doesn't seem like they have much recourse here through the workers, you know, through, what do we call them? I forget what our state entity is called. So I think that's very common. Your point actually relates quite directly to actually the last article that I wrote with an undergraduate student who's now a PhD student. And we looked at the effect of giving driver's licenses to undocumented, which I forget, I think there were like 10 states back then. There are now more states who do that. The effect of that on insurance rates. And it turns out, in Utah, we gave driver's licenses, then driving privileges cards, right? What that allows an undocumented person to do is to get auto insurance. And so what happens is that the incidence of uninsured motorists go down, and your insurance rates go down as a result. And so we actually found across the country, and it varies from state to state, that by regularizing them, you actually benefited the wider society in terms of lowering everyone's insurance rate. The best example of that is the Dreamers, right? The DACA students. These are kids. It's now closed. They can't enroll anymore. But when it started, these were kids who had been brought in, I think, under the age of 16. Who had graduated from a U.S. high school, who had an unblemished penal record. And so they were actually given DACA status, which means that they can actually get a work permit, they can get a Social Security card. And there have been efforts all along to regularize it. They're estimated at around 700,000 to 800,000 across the country now. And their numbers are going down because there's a Texas judge who has ruled that this program is illegal, and so has stopped any new enrollments. So you're getting more and more of these these kids who were brought in at the age of 2 now who are unable to get any regular status. But what that allowed them to do is to get legal jobs, and we now have given, I think, 65 to 70 scholarships to these kids at the University of Utah, not very regal scholarships. They are incredible. And there have been efforts to give them a path to citizenship. There are bills that are proposed all the time that get shot down. But it would mean so much to those kids' lives. We have one of them they find ways, right? One of them married a U.S. He was a male, married a U.S. citizen. He is now a medical doctor. And they all want to contribute to their communities. And if you do that for the wider society, you put your finger on one of the biggest abuses that there is. It would give them a recourse so that they are not exploited. and it would allow them to contribute. As it turns out, if you're undocumented, and I actually hadn't thought about this, I don't know about the DACA kids, but if you're undocumented, you will generally have a social security number, sometimes not legal, or an ITIN.
Mhm.
And so you will report your income to the IRS, and you will pay social security taxes on it. You know, the combination of you plus your employer will pay social security. You will never collect that. And I haven't looked at that for five years or more. Last, I think the total amount of that money that's not going to be collected would be about $40 billion of undocumented people who have paid in who will never collect. So you're exactly right. And the worst, of course, is agriculture, where they're very, very exploited from A to Z. So yeah, you're at least my view is that if we opened up the kind of regularization process with ultimately naturalization, it would be of great benefit to the wider society.
Excuse me, I do have a question. I am from Guatemala. I am a naturalized citizen, and I have an opportunity to talk to my family, and they said, well, all those great benefits you're giving our employees, our citizens in the United States are what is driving all our workforce away, and we are going into deeper debts. I'm not going to agree with everything they're saying, but think about it. We grow coffee, and so we train somebody to run the mills, engineering and everything. He found out that he could make $17 an hour, which in the United States, he packed his bags and left. Now we need to train somebody else. They pack their bags and leave. There is a carrot in the United States.
Mhm.
I'm not saying people should not be paid. People should be paid.
Mhm.
But like you said somewhere back in your discussion, it's a very complicated situation.
Sure.
Because the other countries are also, everybody has to be on the same
Zita,
team. Yeah,
Zita,
yeah.
hold on a second.
Yeah.
We are virtually out of time, but
Yeah,
I want if Ken
exactly.
would respond real quickly to that.
Your point's well taken. There is a push and there is a pull factor, and we have a 3,000-mile border, and our per capita income, I don't know what it is. The median is $57,000 a year, and in Guatemala, I'm sorry, I don't know, but that's right. There is definitely a pull factor. But again, I think it's both the ability to earn $17 an hour. It's not just that they get a whole series of government-run benefits, right? It's really the income discrepancy there. But you're exactly right. And the other side on Guatemala is you had hurricanes that wiped out things, you had drought, and so you've had that big push factor there. And we're getting a lot of Guatemalans at the border, as you point out. So yeah, your point's well taken.
Thank you all. It is 12 o'clock and I'm a stickler for starting and ending on time. So Ken and Scott and everybody who's here, thank you so much. This was a fabulous discussion. See you all later.
Well, thank you, and thank you, League of Women Voters, for what you do. You're very important.
You're so welcome.
Thank you.
Scott, nice to meet you.
You too, Ken. Thanks, everybody. Nice sharing.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.